Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and today we have another apparently existential threat to Israel as we know it to discuss. But this threat is not coming from Iran or Hamas or any other source you might typically expect. Rather, it comes from within, the so-called state within a state here in Israel, a situation in which ultra-Orthodox community allegedly is operating independently and often at odds with the nation as a whole. Far from a new issue, however, the division between Israeli secularists and haredim starting some 70 years ago, with a minor draft exemption for a few dozen yeshiva students. Today, mainstream Israelis are accusing the haredim of being an insular welfare group with questionable governing policies that conflict with the law of the land. Well, joining us to discuss is co-founder of the Women of the Wall, Leah Aharoni, and Rabbi Dov Lipman, former MK with the Yesh Atid party. Thank you both so much for joining us today. It's really my pleasure to have you. Now, I'm actually going to start with you, Rabbi Lipman. It's been argued that Israel cannot continue to be a so-called Western-style state as long as this division continues. Would you agree?
I think that when people talk that way, they're not necessarily in tune to a lot of the changes that are happening on the ground. I personally have been involved in an organization called Avodot LeCharedim, which has helped 80,000 plus Charedim get training, get jobs, become part of Israeli society. So I think that very often it's used as a political wedge, but not necessarily realistic in terms of what's happening on the ground. I do want to see a situation where those who truly are learning Torah day and night, studying in the yeshiva, that's the only thing they want to do, that they're the ones who are doing so, and that everyone else given opportunity to remain Haredi, to remain Talmudic scholars, but also work and be part of Israeli society. But I think it's I do not, especially on the heels of Tisha B'Av, the idea of using that as a wedge issue to break Israel apart, I think that's very far from the reality in terms of what's happening on the ground.
So isn't there more than one way to be a Haredi, though, to be ultra-Orthodox and practice in Israel that does not conform to the stereotype of what that looks like? Because it sounds like there's a massive portion of the population that is studying to be a rabbi, which is an honorable profession, but how many rabbis does Israel need?
They're not necessarily studying to be rabbis. They're studying Torah because it's a value in the population that as part of your life, no matter what you're doing, you have to be studying Torah as well. The question is, can a shift be made? And this is where the politicians have to be smart. Can a shift be made which enables them to continue living the lifestyle they're used to, studying Torah, but also have opportunities to support their families with dignity? There are numerous movements towards having general studies at the high school level, towards training centers to give them the opportunity to support their families with dignity. And I do believe, and this is the critical point here, that as long as the ultra-Orthodox community doesn't feel like someone is coming in and trying to press them to change their way of life, trying to get them to become part of quote-unquote secular society, there is a tremendous amount of openness towards programs which enable both to take place. You can have Torah study and you can have supporting your family and being part of Israeli society. But as long as there's any political agenda, by the way, from both sides, I blame the ultra-Orthodox politicians for turning this into a wedge issue, and I blame other politicians on the other side for turning it into a wedge issue. The ideal should be to sit together and try to work out a way to make this work for everyone.
So, Leah, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but Rabbi, just to stay on you for another second, how then, based on what you've just said, do you respond to, say, Israel's chief rabbi, who recently said that secular subjects are nonsense and should not be included in the study for Haredim?
See, I reject that. I mean, I have to watch myself. I'm speaking in front of a respectful rabbi who said these words, but that kind of rhetoric is not helpful in this situation. Of course, there's a benefit in the ultra-Orthodox young men learning English and learning mathematics. And I've met young men who are 20, 25 who don't know it and feel like they've been robbed of an opportunity to support their families with dignity. So let's remove all that rhetoric from the equation and let's be pragmatic and figure out what would be the best thing. There is no one that I know of who would be hurt if for an hour or two a day they had basic general studies where no outside influences came in. We can decide what the books would say and make sure that they're not going against the Torah values in any way, but learn English, learn math. That's totally consistent with all of Jewish tradition and even with the greatest of Torah scholars throughout our history.
All right, Leah, I want to turn to you now and bring you into the conversation. How do you respond to some of the things that Rabbi Lippman just said, and where do you see the division?
So first of all, I agree with all the data that Rabbi Lippman is presenting, but I'd like to say something different, though. This kind of rhetoric that we're seeing coming out would be considered racist and absolutely inappropriate had it been leveled at any other community, at Arabs, at African Americans. And somehow politicians and pundits allow themselves to say things about Jews in America, for example, and about the Haredim in Israel that they would never dare say about any other community. And this kind of paternalistic, entitled and racist rhetoric has no place in the discussion. Unfortunately, it creates the effect that it desires to create. Just last week, a study showed that 40% of secular Israelis hate the Haredim. And obviously, this is not sustainable. We cannot have a society where one part of the population hates another part of the population at such a rate. And the politicians really need to rein in the rhetoric. It could not be sustained anymore.
So again, just to press a little further, what do you think is the source of this division, or at least some of the major driving factors?
Like I said, I think that pundits and especially politicians are using such rhetoric for a divide and conquer effect to garner votes, and it creates the effect. It's, we have Haredim and we have the secular. Many of them are brothers and sisters, literally parts of the same family. And we are part of the same Jewish family. We have to live together, and we cannot allow politicians to use this as a wedge issue.
So to follow up on maybe the political aspect, it's been argued in the past that Israel is undergoing a quote-unquote Lebanonization, and that is the sectarianism within the government formed on largely religious and identity political lines. Would you be in support of eliminating or barring political groups that exist on the basis of religion?
So we need to understand that Israel's demographics are changing. If until 10 years ago, there was a large secular majority and everybody else was a minority, today there are 5 tribes of Israel, 5 minority groups, each one numbering between 1 and 2 million people: the secular, the traditional, the National Orthodox, the Haredi, and the Arabs. There is no majority. There are 5 minorities, and each one has a different vision for the country. And this is why, by the way, we just had 4 rounds of elections, because we do not have a stable majority. None of these minorities has a right to dictate how the country has to look. All of these minorities have to come together in a joint vision from a place of peace and discussion and give and take and negotiation, and create a joint vision. But it's a new development. Not everybody understands it. Not everybody has accepted it. And this is why we're seeing the political instability. Like Rabbi Lippman, I agree that we need to be pragmatic. Every community has the right to live by its values. And we have to live out of respect for each other's values and come together and create a joint vision for 10 million Jews who are here. The secular are not going anywhere. The Haredi are not going anywhere, and the Arabs are not going anywhere. We will all have to live together in peace and in a way that is sustainable for all communities.
So again, just to follow up, and then Rabbi Lippman, I'll turn the question to you. How do you propose we create that integrated society? Because it sounds like it would take a great deal of compromise on both sides, the Haredi, the secular, and non-Jews as well, to get there, especially within Israel. Does it seem to you, Leah, that the Haredi public in Israel is more isolated within Israel than the Haredi community in places abroad, say the United States?
I don't think so. I don't think the Haredi community in Israel is isolated. And also, I don't think we can talk about the Haredi community.
I think would have been a better word for me to have used.
Right. But in any case, there are 1.2 million Haredim. They're not all the same. They may look all the same from the outside, but it's a very varied, heterogeneous community. And every part of that community has a different lifestyle. So let's stop talking about Haredim like this one black and white wall that all look the same and all march to the same tune. It's a varied community. There are people in there who learn, and that's a very small minority of Haredim, by the way. Only 120,000 Haredim actually study in a kollel, in a yeshiva. and the other million do not. Many of them are women and children, but not all Haredim are in a yeshiva, and many Haredim work, and Haredim come in all kinds of flavors and have all kinds of ideas and vote for all kinds of parties. So let's stop painting them with this, broad brush strokes. And the way for this to work is really out of the place of respect.
Okay.
When there is respect, there is a possibility to create this joint vision.
Rabbi Lippman?
You know, you study the history when Israel was founded, the secular founders of the state, who I revere for what they did, they were anti-religious. They didn't want to see a state that was filled with scholars, Torah scholars, and religious observance. But I was just sitting a few weeks ago in an inauguration of a new president of Israel, and sitting there, every time they decided to say words of Torah or anything spiritual, the speaker of the Knesset, the outgoing president, and the incoming president put a kippah on their heads and talked with great reverence about spirituality and religion. There's a shift that's happening in broader Israel, which I think is very important for the ultra-Orthodox community and especially their leaders to recognize and pay credit to. And the rhetoric has to stop on both sides and allow processes on the ground to take place. Integration into the workforce, integration into the army, integration into universities. But as Haredim are interested in doing so, secular, broader Israel has to make accommodations to some of their values, such as separate classes, separate units, with compromises on all sides, and also recognizing that there are going to be those scholars who are just going to sit and study Torah no matter what, and that's going to be part of Israeli society. But if we have that attitude which says our ultimate goal is to make this work, not to change anybody, but to find a way to make this work. Once that language is being used, and I've sat in meetings where I've seen it in front of my eyes, amazing things can happen, and we are able to overcome all the impasses that are in the way and create a harmonious Israel where everyone feels comfortable being here.
So more on that. The military draft, which you just touched upon, is seen as one of the largest conflicts between these two very large and varied communities, as Leah pointed out. How close to a solution to that do you think that we are, and especially given the new changed government with Finance Minister Avigdor Lieberman, who is seen as an oppositional force to the Haredi public?
You know, Lieberman came out with an announcement which was very hurtful to a large part of the Haredi public, and especially hurting their wives and children more than anything else. And there was pushback, not just from the ultra-Orthodox community, but from even members of his own coalition. And now he's delayed it till November, and we'll see what happens. Every issue that comes up, including the army, has to be done with in a gentle, kind, understanding way. I was part of a process in 2014 as a member of Knesset. I sat in meetings. You cannot imagine who was sitting together in these meetings where behind the scenes, not in front of the cameras, everyone was trying to work out solutions. There is no one in Israel today, no one in the Knesset at least, who is suggesting that we go in and we take all the yeshiva boys out of yeshiva and draft them into the army. Some of the Haredi politicians will use that rhetoric, but that's not what's happening. There is an attempt to try to find some kind of a solution where at the very least, those who really aren't studying Torah day and night, and with all due respect to the yeshivot, even if there are 120,000 there, that after a few years, a large percentage are ready to move on in life, to find a way for them to go into some kind of service, whether it's military service in a Haredi unit or national service of some kind, and open the world of the job market to them. So there are ways to find solutions to all of these issues as long as both sides don't talk in extreme manners and really try to sit down and find a solution. And all the ideas on the table in the Knesset today that I have seen do take that approach of let's be pragmatic, let's figure out numbers that are realistic, and most importantly, Aaron, this is the most important point, to allow those yeshiva boys who ideologically are not going to go to the army, and I can fight with them day and night and say that I believe it's the greatest thing someone religious can do, but they disagree with me, and I can't change their minds on that, to enable them to go to work. If they don't want to learn in yeshiva anymore, but they don't want to go to the army, right now the laws require them to stay in yeshiva. They can't join the workforce until a much older age. The best thing for Israel is to free them to go to work, and then all of a sudden they'll be contributing, quote unquote, members of Israeli society in terms of paying taxes, in terms of working, supporting their families with dignity, that will remove a lot of the image that's out there of the Haredi community taking from broader Israel, but not giving. So that's something which also can help on a practical level and also on an emotional level to try to bring some more harmony here.
All right, now we've talked a lot about the government and their responsibility, and the public and the different parts of the public and their responsibility towards one another. Where does the rabbinate fit into all of this, and how willing of a partner, or how open of a partner do you see the rabbinate in making some of these compromises that we're discussing? Leah?
So the rabbinate, if you're talking about the chief rabbinate, does really not have a lot of sway in the Haredi community. If you're talking about the rabbinic leadership of the Haredi community, so the leadership works with the community and leads the community to create the changes that the community needs. For example, 10 years ago, Haredi women were relegated to mostly jobs in the educational sector. And when the rabbis saw that the community needed a change, they worked with forces within the community to create new options of employment. And today you will see Haredi women working in high tech, in business, in practically every sector, and getting advanced education in frameworks and institutions that work for this community. So the rabbis of the community understand the community, and they are the leaders. And anybody who wants to create a change on the ground has to work with the community and its leadership, not go over the head of the community and its leadership. Like Lieberman recently said, I'm going to do what's best for the Haredim, even if they don't agree. I'm sorry, Mr. Lieberman, you don't know better than the Haredim what's good for them. So working with the rabbinical and the lay leadership and the political leadership, which the Haredim have chosen for themselves, is the solution for any kind of change on the ground.
Now, you're talking about the Haredi leadership on the community level as really working somewhat independently from the rabbinate. And we know that in secular society in Israel, there's also a lot of pushback against the bureaucracy and the alleged religious pushing and forcefulness that the rabbinate sometimes imposes. Do you think that it's time the rabbinate is overhauled or reworked or rethought or even abolished?
No, I don't think so. Israel has been established on the principle of the status quo. In 1948, we all sat around the table and decided that there will be certain aspects of Jewishness and Jewish observance in the public sphere. And this is what enables Israel to stay a Jewish state. And it's part of our society and our culture. And the rabbinate is in charge of that. How do we define Israel as a Jewish state? What does it look like? What does it mean in terms of personal status and kashrut and Shabbat observance? And if you pay attention, over the past 75 years, the status quo has been shifting to the secular side and has been really cut down. I think preserving a certain sense of Jewish observance in the public sphere and in the Israeli society is necessary, and the rabbinate is a tool for that. Unfortunately, it is constantly being cut down and disempowered by the media and the politicians. It's become the scapegoat for all the wrongs of the society. And we need to give it the power back and the funding to really function and run this part of our public life.
Rabbi Lippman, same question. Do you see the rabbinate's role as being fulfilled properly? Would you like to see any changes in the way that the rabbinate operates, maybe in the bureaucracy, in its relationship with the country, et cetera?
I served in the Knesset during a period of time of elections for the chief rabbi, and this is not in any way what I'm saying now a reflection about the two rabbis who now hold those positions, but just seeing that process. This is not an office which is in functioning now there to help broader Israel and who can help broader Israel in terms of its Jewishness. We go back to the Rabbi Kook model many, many decades ago, where the whole idea of the rabbinate was to make sure that Judaism was accessible to all and open to bring people into the fold, and not some kind of a watchdog to make sure that people are actually pushed outside of the fold. And I think sadly over the last number of decades, we've shifted to that second model, and it's really pushing people away. I would love to see a rabbinate where the meetings are held to sit down and say, how can we bring more Jews in Israel to feel like they're part of the Jewish establishment and connected Jewishly, instead of something which is doing the opposite and making things even more strict and more difficult for people to adhere to. There is a tremendous thirst and quest within broader Israel for people to find some kind of a connection spiritually and Jewishly. And if we open those doors, instead of closing opportunities, tremendous things can happen in terms of everyone feeling like proud Jews in the Jewish state. Yes, there are certain issues where there is halakha involved, and we have to be very cautious in terms of breaking that, in terms of creating a scenario where we no longer even have unity on some basic issues within the Jewish state. And the rabbinate can toe that line. But on issues where they can, to look for the lenient opinions, to look for the embracing opinions, to find ways on conversion and other issues, there are opinions out there within the Orthodox community going back hundreds of years, which can be relied upon for so many issues. The power of a rabbi, it's easy to be strict. The power was always defined by someone who, based on the sources, has the confidence and ability to be more lenient, to be able to help people connect to their Judaism. That ultimately should be the role of the rabbinate. And in that sense, I do believe there needs to be an overhaul and a very different perspective in terms of its role.
So Leah, again, back to you. Final question. Do you think that the rabbinate could be doing a better job, that as Rabbi Lippman suggested, as today, it might be doing a little bit more harm than good when it comes to unifying the Jewish people worldwide? And how could the rabbinate maybe reform its practices a little bit to become more welcoming without shifting to the more secular side, as you suggested before?
So obviously, Rabbi Lippman and I do not agree on this issue. Everybody can always do a better job. There's always room for improvement in every single organization, and the rabbinate is certainly not an exception to that. I think the rabbinate is not treated with the respect that it deserves. It does not get the funds and the resources that it deserves in the government. And it's sort of like a stepchild to the Israeli government, and hence it doesn't function at its optimal levels. However, I just met with Rabbi Lau, the Chief Rabbi Lau, last week. He is an incredible, sensitive person who is sensitive and very invested in the welfare of every single Jew, in bringing as many Jews into the fold and having as many Jews have that spiritual experience that Rabbi Lippman is talking about. And we need to treat the rabbinate with the same respect we treat every other body in the government and in the country, and give it the resources that it needs. And respect its decision. I don't think the politicians are the ones to tell the rabbis how to rule on halachic issues, on issues of Jewish law. Rabbis should be ruling on issues of Jewish law, and doctors should be ruling on issues of health, and economists should be ruling on issues of economics. And once we respect the authority of the rabbis to rule on these issues and give them the resources to preserve the Jewish nature of the state, I'm sure they will do just fine.
All right. With that, unfortunately, I have to end this conversation. I really, truly wish that we could keep it going, and I know that we could. In the meantime, thank you so much, Rabbi Lippman, Leah Aharoni, for joining us. It's been my pleasure. I'm Aaron Porras. Please tune in next time on Insider for more on everything Israel. If there's a topic that you'd like us to cover next, let us know about it in the comment sections online. And finally, for more news from Israel, follow ILTV on Facebook and on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and ILTV.tv channels. Thank you so much. Be well. We'll see you soon.